You did this!
No, we have to go now!
I'm not going anywhere with you!
Please trust me! Everyone back! It's not safe! My God, the whole thing's going up! Help me, moving out! The cabin's gone! Get to the trucks! Copy that, moving out! Go, go, go!
She threatened to have my daughter arrested for trespassing on our own dock. 3 days later, I handed her an eviction notice for the estate she'd called home for 12 years. It's 5:30 a.m. in northern Idaho. A thick, silver mist is clinging to the surface of Spirit Lake, making everything feel hushed and heavy. My 10-year-old daughter, Maya, is standing next to me on our pier, white-knuckling her spinning rod. She's vibrating with a mix of confusion and pure adrenaline. In the distance, the low rumble of a county cruiser's tires on our gravel driveway breaks the silence. And there she is, Evelyn Thorne, 62 years old, sporting a platinum bob and dressed head to toe in designer athleisure. She's standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, pointing a manicured finger at us like we're some kind of public health hazard, all because we dared to cast a line at sunrise. What Evelyn didn't realize was that she'd spent the last 9 years playing dictator of the woods, running a completely fraudulent HOA and shaking down her neighbors for over $40,000 in dues. But more importantly, she didn't know that I now held the deed to the very ground beneath her feet. Before we dive into how I dismantled her entire world, drop a comment below. What would you do if a neighbor called the cops on your kid for just being a kid? And let me know where you're watching from. I'm willing to bet a good portion of you are currently dealing with a power-tripping HOA board member right now. The new start. Let's rewind 6 months. My name is Elias Vance. I'm 45, and for 20 years I worked as a senior industrial land surveyor before selling my firm and opting for a slower pace of life. I'd just gone through a divorce, civil, no drama, just 2 people who grew apart, and we shared custody of Maya. I moved to Spirit Lake looking for a fresh start. It's a tiny town, maybe 4,000 people, where everyone knows your business but usually keeps to themselves. I bought a 1980s cedar siding cabin on North Shore Drive for $380,000. It was a bit weathered, but it came with 150 feet of private shoreline. When I first walked through the house, it smelled like wood smoke and old cedar. But when I stepped out onto that back deck and saw the sun hitting the water, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Here's the thing about me. My grandfather was a title attorney in Chicago. He spent my childhood teaching me that the world isn't run by people, it's run by paper. I built my career on finding the invisible lines, the easements, the encroachments, and the forgotten boundaries that most people ignore. I bought this place in a bit of a post-divorce haze. The agent, a local guy named Miller, mentioned some neighborhood traditions, but I didn't think twice about it. How complicated could a lakeside road be? Maya took to the lake instantly. It was the one thing that made the transition between 2 houses easier for her. I spent my first month doing the heavy lifting, replacing rotted pier boards and sealing the deck. I can still remember the smell of that wood stain and the ache in my lower back. It was honest, satisfying work. Then I met Evelyn Thorne. She's the self-styled director of the Spirit Lake Preservation Society. Her husband, Gerald, owns the largest hardware chain in the county. They are the definition of local royalty, Rotary Club, Country Club, and friends with every township official. Their house is a massive, modern craftsman build, probably worth $1.2 million, dominating the shoreline. Evelyn drives a black Range Rover with the plate Lake Pro. 2 weeks in, I'm working on my dock when I hear the sharp clack 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 of designer sandals on wood. You'll need to submit your shoreline maintenance plan to the board for approval, she says, her smile not reaching her eyes. We maintain strict aesthetic standards to protect the collective equity of the shore. I was confused. The board, I own this shoreline and the lake is public water. She handed me a thick, laminated packet, a $600 annual preservation fee. rules about what color umbrellas I could have, boat engine limits, even restrictions on when I could have guests. I handed it back. I'm not interested. I own my land to the high water mark. Her smile didn't just fade, it turned into a mask of ice. The smell of her perfume, something like heavy lilies and laundry starch, was cloying in the lake air. "Everyone who belongs here participates, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "It would be a shame to start your new life as an outsider." I did some digging that night. I searched for Spirit Lake HOA in the county database. Nothing. I called Miller, my realtor. He just laughed nervously. "Oh, that's just Evelyn's group. Most people pay the few $100 just to keep her from complaining to the building inspector every week." My gut told me something was rotten, but I wanted a quiet life for Maya. I tucked away the original survey I'd found in the basement, a dusty map with faded ink, and decided to stay under the radar. But a week later, my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a sweet woman who's lived there since the '60s, brought over a pie. She leaned in close, her eyes darting toward Evelyn's mansion. "Just a warning, Elias. Evelyn doesn't like being told no." My late husband tried to fight her on the dock fees, and suddenly the township was at our door every week for noise violations that didn't exist. I thanked her, but I didn't realize how prophetic she was. The conflict escalates. 3 weeks later, it's a Saturday just after 7 a.m. The air is crisp, that first bite of autumn. I'm on the dock with Maya, teaching her how to cast a lure without catching her own ear. The lake is glass. You could hear a pin drop. Then the clack-clack returns. Evelyn is marching down the path in a designer tracksuit. "Activity is restricted until 9 a.m., she barks. "You're disturbing the peace of the cove." I looked at her deadpan. "Evelyn, we're just fishing. We aren't even talking." She pulled out her phone and started recording us. The digital shutter clicks sounded like gunshots in the quiet. "I'm documenting your refusal to comply with community bylaws. You're harassing the local waterfowl." She then produced a covenant of residence card, claiming the whole block was bound by it since the 1980s. I told her I never signed a thing. She snapped back, "It's a running covenant. It stays with the land. Check your title if you can even read one." Here's a tip for everyone. A covenant is only as good as the county's stamp. If it isn't recorded at the courthouse, it's just a piece of paper with a fancy font. Monday morning, I went to the recorder of deeds. The office was quiet, smelling of old paper and industrial cleaner. The clerk, a guy named Pete, helped me pull the files for North Shore Drive. Result: 0. No HOA, no restrictive covenants since 1982. And those had a 20-year sunset clause that expired decades ago. There was nothing. I wrote Evelyn a formal letter. I kept it professional. "According to county records, your organization has no legal authority. Please cease all contact regarding fees or rules." I dropped it in her mailbox myself. 2 days later, Gerald Thorne, the husband, shows up. It's dusk, and the bugs are swarming the porch light. Gerald has that good old boy charm, but his eyes are as cold as the lake in winter. "Elias, let's be neighbors here," he says, leaning against my railing. "The fee is a drop in the bucket. It keeps the riffraff out. If you don't play ball, the township might start looking real close at that unpermitted roof work you did." My blood turned to ice. "Are you threatening me, Gerald?" "Just giving you a heads up. People around here look out for each other. You don't want to be the one nobody looks out for." The next morning, a township truck was in my driveway. The inspector was a guy I'd never seen before. He spent an hour looking for structural violations on my deck. He didn't find any, but he looked annoyed that he had to be there. "Just doing my job, sir. We get calls." That's when it clicked. Evelyn and Gerald weren't just neighbors. They were the local government. They used the bureaucracy like a weapon. I started a log. Every time she filmed us, every time a mysterious inspector showed up, every anonymous note left on my windshield. Most people would have folded, but I'm a surveyor. I deal in cold, hard facts. A week later, the social pressure started. Mrs. Gable stopped bringing pie. Other neighbors looked away when I drove by. Then Maya came home crying. Her best friend from the local school had uninvited her from a birthday party. The mother told Maya that it's better if our families don't mix right now. Evelyn was poisoning the well. I started talking to the other neighbors in private. I found out 5 families had been paying her dues for nearly a decade. That's thousands of dollars vanishing into Evelyn's pocket. One guy, a local mechanic, tried to stop paying, and suddenly the town wouldn't renew his business license. This wasn't an HOA, it was a protection racket. I contacted the state's attorney's office. They were interested but told me that without a massive paper trail or a formal corporate entity to sue, it was a he said, she said civil matter. So I decided to go to the source. Evelyn held her committee meetings in her dining room. I walked in uninvited on a Wednesday night. The room was opulent, velvet chairs, a chandelier that cost more than my truck, and the overwhelming scent of vanilla candles. 6 neighbors sat there, looking like they were at a funeral. I'd like to see the tax ID and the financial ledger for this organization, I said. The room went silent. Evelyn's face turned a shade of purple I've only seen in sunsets. This is a private meeting for members. You're trespassing. Leave or I'll call the sheriff. The invite said all residents of North Shore, I replied. I'm a resident. Where is the money going, Evelyn? She called the cops. A young deputy named Miller, different from the realtor, showed up. He looked embarrassed. He told me, "Sir, the Thorns are big supporters of the department. Just go home. Don't make this harder on yourself." I left, but I didn't go home. I went to the library. I spent the next 48 hours buried in historical property records. I tracked the original subdivision developer, a company called Northwood Development that went belly up in the early 90s. And that's when I found it, a tiny, overlooked detail in a bankruptcy filing from 30 years ago. When Northwood Development went under, their assets were auctioned off. Most people bought the lots, but the residual assets, the private access roads, the common areas, and the management rights to the entire subdivision were bought by a shell company that had been dormant for 3 decades. I tracked the owner of that shell company. It was my father. He had bought those rights as a speculative investment in the 90s and forgotten about them. When he died, they passed to me in a box of worthless deeds I'd never bothered to verify. I didn't just own my house. I owned the road Evelyn used to get to her driveway. I owned the land under her private pier. I owned the rights to every common area she'd been managing. I called an old colleague who specializes in forensic titles. "Check the auction records from 1994, I told her. "Tell me I'm not dreaming." She called me back 4 hours later. "Elias, you don't just own the road. You are the developer. You have the legal right to dissolve the committee, gate the road, or, and this is the fun part, charge a lease for any encroachment on developer-owned land." I looked out my window at Evelyn's house. I wasn't going to just win. I was going to take the ground from under her feet. Back to Saturday morning, 6:30 a.m. Evelyn is screaming about the sheriff again. She's shouting about how people like us don't belong here. She thinks she has the power. She thinks the sheriff is her personal security. She has no idea that in my back pocket, I have a cease and desist order for her entire driveway. Sheriff Braddock pulls up looking exhausted. He looks at me, then at Evelyn. "What now, Evelyn?" "He's on the common shore. Arrest him," she shrieks. I stepped forward and handed the sheriff a folder. "Actually, Sheriff, I'm not on common ground. I'm on my ground, and as it turns out, so is Mrs. Thorne's house, at least the front 20 feet of it." The look on Evelyn's face was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen. But the real kicker, I wasn't just there to talk about the land. I was there to talk about the 12 years of back rent she owed the developer for using a road she didn't own. The paperwork took 3 hours. I transferred enough money to buy a house into what was essentially the world's most expensive gate. Closing was set for Friday, giving me 10 days to build infrastructure that would make the Berlin Wall look like a garden fence. I spent the next week throwing money at contractors like a drunken lottery winner. Fence-tight construction got the call for 8-foot chain link with barbed wire and industrial locks. Precision Security designed a perimeter that would make the Pentagon jealous. I even ordered 20 private property signs large enough to be read from low Earth orbit. My only requirement: finish by Friday. Money was no object. Some people buy boats. I was buying the most satisfying enforcement project in legal history. Friday morning, as I signed the final papers, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was so perfect I laughed out loud in the quiet legal office. "Mr. Thompson, this is Delia Kramer. Your fence violations have escalated beyond acceptable limits. Meet me at your property line tomorrow at 8:00 a.m. sharp. This ends now." I showed the text to the closing attorney, who asked what was so funny about a threat. I explained it wasn't a threat. It was a formal invitation to watch someone walk into the most expensive trap in Tennessee history. Saturday morning at 7:55 a.m., I was standing at my boundary with a thermos of coffee and 21 pages of legal ammunition, watching Delia's BMW approach like a heat-seeking missile. The engine shut off with German precision, and out stepped our suburban dictator in her full battle regalia. A power blazer that screamed expensive lawyer, designer heels entirely unfit for Tennessee grass, and a leather briefcase that cost more than my truck payment. Behind her was a nervous man in khakis with surveying gear. I felt sorry for him. He was about to become collateral damage. Delia marched across my lawn with the supreme confidence of someone who'd never faced real opposition. Her stilettos punched perfect holes in my turf with every step. She stopped 6 feet onto my land and announced that we were finally going to resolve this fence situation, like civilized adults who understood community standards. I took a slow sip of coffee, agreed enthusiastically, and then casually mentioned she was currently committing criminal trespass by standing on my land without permission. She froze mid-stride, her suburban mom mask cracking to reveal the rage underneath. She launched into a prepared speech about my malicious interference with established traffic patterns that benefited the neighborhood. When I asked her to clarify those patterns, she actually said it out loud: that residents had used the convenient access route through my land for years. I pulled out my phone and started recording, asking her to confirm on camera that she was referring to a route used without a legal easement or written permission. With dramatic flair, she opened her briefcase and produced a thick manila folder. She announced her legal team had prepared documentation proving my interference was a public nuisance under Tennessee law. She handed me 15 pages of impressively manufactured legal fiction, complete with professional letterhead, official stamps, and enough jargon to choke a law school graduating class. She thought she'd won. She didn't realize that while she was printing fake documents, I was busy buying the dirt beneath her feet and the air she was breathing. Delia, Legal Analysis of Property Access Rights, was a masterpiece of manufactured fiction, covering everything from adverse possession to community benefit. It might have intimidated someone who hadn't spent a week studying actual law, but I just flipped through it while pointing out they'd overlooked a minor detail. When she snapped, demanding to know what, I pulled out the 2003 construction easement. I read the expiration date aloud: December 2004. The easement had been dead for 20 years, making every one of her convenient commutes a criminal trespass under Tennessee code. Delia's face turned 6 shades of red while her surveyor, Michael, suddenly stopped his work, realizing he was standing in legal quicksand. She tried to argue that law was flexible, but I explained that you can't establish a legal right by consistently breaking the law for 2 decades. In a desperate move, she called the county planning department right there. I sipped my coffee and watched the show. 5 minutes of frustrated shouting later, she hung up. The county had confirmed no such public route existed. Michael, the surveyor, then delivered the final blow. He refused to falsify a prescriptive easement claim, citing it as criminal fraud. That's when I dropped the nuclear bomb. I told her I'd closed on the Hartwell property yesterday afternoon. Her shortcut didn't just cross my land, it was now surrounded by it. Monday morning arrived like a war movie. 3 contractor trucks rolled in to begin the Great Fence project. They brought equipment fit for a federal prison and cameras enough to film a blockbuster. By 9:00 a.m., 8-foot chain link was rising, and motion sensors were being mounted every 100 feet. I was having the time of my retirement life. When Delia drove up, screaming about building codes, the foreman, a man who looked like he'd been installing barriers since the dawn of time, didn't blink. He calmly informed her that all permits were filed, the work was legal, and she needed to move her BMW because she was currently blocking equipment on private land. Delia's response was to summon every regulatory agency in Tennessee, from building inspectors to the sheriff. Over 2 hours of frantic calls, she discovered that 40 years of engineering experience makes for a bulletproof paper trail. I'd filed every permit and met every code with doctoral-level precision. Tuesday brought a fresh audacity: tire tracks across my original 15 acres. She was so desperate to maintain her shortcut that she'd bypassed the main fortification to trespass elsewhere. It was like a bank robber hitting the back door while police installed cameras at the front. I signaled Bobby to extend the line, merging both properties into one 55-acre fortress of enforcement. Wednesday saw her most desperate gambit. She arrived with a new surveyor, waving fabricated documents claiming errors in the county records that somehow placed my land within an expanded Willowbrook development zone. I invited the surveyor to compare his fiction against my certified copies from the clerk's office. I watched his professional credibility evaporate as he realized he'd been hired to validate a fantasy. He apologized, packed his gear, and fled, leaving Delia standing alone with her worthless papers, a woman discovering that reality doesn't bend to her expectations. Thursday escalated into a total meltdown. Delia showed up with bolt cutters. Hacking at the fence she claimed sat on HOA soil. Bobby called the sheriff while I recorded a high-definition record of her committing criminal property damage. Deputy Rodriguez arrived and explained that imaginary rights don't excuse criminal mischief. The look on her face when he offered her a choice between a peaceful exit or handcuffs was pure gold. She left screaming about federal violations, but Friday morning brought the absurd grand finale. Delia arrived with a moving truck and 2 day laborers. Her plan: to physically relocate my fence and carve out her own path. I watched this suburban general prepare her assault before calling my attorney, Sarah Kai. Sarah told me to keep the cameras rolling. She was bringing the paperwork to end this nonsense permanently. Sarah stepped out of her car with the look defense attorneys get when a client confesses on live TV. She watched Delia and her hired muscle attacking my fence with crowbars and started laughing so hard I thought she'd need a medic. Within 20 minutes, Sarah had documented the carnage, taken statements from Bobby's crew, and informed the day laborers they were committing felony property destruction on camera. They dropped their tools and vanished instantly, leaving Delia standing alone with a crowbar and a rapidly crumbling sense of reality. When Sarah warned her about the criminal implications, Delia screeched about interstate commerce regulations and HOA authority. That's when Sarah turned this local spat into a statewide scandal. She called Rita Walsh, an investigative journalist who lived for stories of suburban corruption. Rita was on site within 2 hours. By Saturday, a Channel 7 news van was idling on my grass. Rita interviewed Sarah on property law, talked to Bobby about the damage, and got Deputy Rodriguez to confirm that criminal charges were on the table. Sunday's lead story, HOA president accused of chronic trespassing, was a masterpiece. It used the expired easement and my video footage to paint Delia as a cautionary tale of unchecked entitlement. Monday morning, my phone didn't stop. Willowbrook residents, emboldened by the news, called to share their own horror stories of Delia's creative leadership. The fence dispute had cracked the dam, releasing years of complaints about financial irregularities and vote manipulation. By Tuesday, the State HOA Oversight Commission launched a formal investigation. Sarah called me Wednesday, her voice vibrating with excitement. The commission had found 3 years of missing improvement funds that had mysteriously funneled into projects for Delia's friends. They found proxy ballots from people who had moved away years ago, and a pattern of selective enforcement that looked more like racketeering than neighborhood management. The real bombshell, however, was buried in the meeting minutes Sarah had subpoenaed. The subpoenaed minutes were the smoking gun. They revealed Delia had been running the HOA like a personal cartel. She'd negotiated free landscaping for herself in exchange for exclusive contracts, secured discounted waste management while residents paid premiums, and even had the security firm monitor her home for free on the association's dime. Thursday morning, Sarah called with news that made me dance a jig. The State Commission had issued an emergency suspension of Willowbrook's legal standing. Their authority was gone. Every fine, every antique ivory violation, and every contract Delia had ever signed was now legally void and subject to fraud review. Her empire hadn't just fallen, it had vaporized. The final blow came Friday when Deputy Rodriguez informed me that the DA was filing criminal charges for the fence incident: first-degree criminal mischief, trespassing, and conspiracy. Bail was set at $50,000, but the rabbit hole went deeper. Sarah's research revealed this was Delia's third HOA presidency. She'd fled 2 previous communities under clouds of financial irregularities, always staying one step ahead of the law. This time, she'd picked the wrong retired engineer. The state's 73-page preliminary report was a masterclass in corruption, recommending total dissolution of the board and criminal prosecution for everyone involved. By Tuesday, a notice was taped to every door in Willowbrook. All HOA authority was suspended, and 3 years of fines were to be refunded with interest. The state's tip line was ringing off the hook as victims of Delia's 20-year reign finally found their voices. Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after she'd attacked my property with a crowbar, I watched the news as Tennessee's most infamous HOA president was led away in handcuffs, charged with embezzlement, fraud, and racketeering. Thursday, the state receiver called to invite me to a mandatory community meeting on Saturday. I marked my calendar with the glee of a man who had spent $200,000 to watch a $500 fine turn into a life sentence for his enemy. Saturday afternoon arrived with crisp Tennessee clarity. The community center parking lot resembled a suburban refugee camp as residents gathered to learn the true cost of Delia's leadership. I arrived early with Sarah Kai and Rita Walsh, whose camera crew was poised to capture the final chapter of this corruption saga. State Receiver Margaret Thompson took the podium at 2:00 p.m., reading a statement so devastating it effectively erased Delia's reputation from the map. The investigation had uncovered over $400,000 in irregularities, diverted improvement funds, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, and blatant insurance fraud for phantom property damage. The room went silent as the numbers climbed like a corruption jackpot. Then came the creative accounting. Thompson detailed landscaping contracts that billed the association for premium work, while board members received cut-rate services for free. There were security fees for uninstalled equipment and maintenance assessments for community facilities that had been closed for years. The room erupted into a low, angry hum as neighbors realized they'd been systematically robbed. What began as curiosity transformed into the kind of collective fury that makes politicians tremble. But the true nuclear bomb was still coming. Receiver Thompson revealed that the misconduct extended far beyond embezzlement. Delia had been manipulating property assessments for tax purposes, Working with a corrupt county official, she had artificially inflated values for her enemies while slashing them for her supporters. This wasn't just HOA drama anymore. It was systematic tax fraud stealing from schools and emergency services. The federal implications were massive: mail fraud, wire fraud, and potential RICO violations for running a criminal enterprise under the guise of community leadership. Just as the weight of the revelation settled, a voice from the crowd asked the one question I'd been waiting for since this entire war began. Receiver Thompson's response was music to my ears. She confirmed the association had zero authority outside their boundaries. The easement had expired in 2004, and any claim of prescriptive rights was a legal joke. But then she buried Delia. The investigation found that every cent spent on lawyers to harass me had been embezzled from the Community Improvement Fund. The room erupted. Residents were no longer just curious. They were a mob realizing they had been systematically robbed. Thompson restored order and oversaw a real election, one with paper ballots and zero proxy manipulation. The most satisfying moment came when the state's corrective plan was read. Every violation was canceled, every fine from the last 3 years would be refunded with interest, and all legal actions were dismissed with prejudice. My antique ivory fine was dead, my legal fees were reimbursed, and Delia's campaign of harassment was now a criminal record that would haunt her forever. The applause was deafening. Rita Walsh asked me for a final quote, and I told her the truth. Sometimes the best defense against power is simply knowing the law better than those who think they're above it. Property rights still mean something in America, even if it costs $200,000 to prove it. 6 months later, I stood on my hilltop. The fence was still there, a monument to the war that cost Delia her freedom, but the atmosphere had changed. The new board, made of actual neighbors, approached me with a proposal that restored my faith in community. They didn't demand a shortcut. They worked with the county to fix the actual road infrastructure, adding a traffic light that solved the 12-minute delay legitimately. Then they asked to lease a small strip of my land for a legal, surveyed emergency route. They offered fair market value, insurance, and a transparent contract. Standing there, watching the sunset over my 50 acres, I realized the victory wasn't just about the gate. It was about the transition from a suburban dictatorship to a neighborhood built on mutual respect. Justice had been served. My retirement was finally peaceful, and for the first time in 8 years, the only thing crossing my property line was a sense of genuine neighborly goodwill.